Ah, my child, come closer and sit down next to me. I have a story to tell you about how science came out of the darkness and into the light. There was a time when the world was in a long silence. Knowledge was hidden in the dusty pages of ancient books, locked away in the minds of a few wise people. But then came an era when the human mind broke its chains. People started looking at the sky, the stars, and the depths of nature with new eyes. That era was the Renaissance. Back then, a breeze of change was blowing through the streets of Europe. Art, literature, architecture, and most importantly, science. All these came together to shake up the rigid rules of the old world. The locked doors of knowledge were opening one by one, and observation and reason were replacing the old dogmas. Science was no longer just for philosophers. It belonged to brave people who experimented, observed, and calculated. Today I'm going to tell you the stories of those brave people. Some looked up at the sky, trying to unlock the secrets of the planets. Others studied the human body, trying to understand how nature worked. Some played with fire, chemistry, and metals, trying to transform materials. And of course, they were all after one thing, the truth. But, my child, the truth is not always welcomed. As you listen, remember that every great discovery came with a price. Some were cast out by society, some were judged by the church, and some even risked their lives to defend what they knew. Now, let's clear away the fog of time and meet the great scientists of the Renaissance. If you're ready, our journey begins now. Oh, my young friend, let me tell you a story from the depths of time. There was a time when the world was hidden behind a veil of mist. Freedom of thought was restricted, and the doors of knowledge were tightly shut. Throughout the Middle Ages, the human mind was bound by the chains of dogma. The church was seen as the only source of absolute truth, and thinking about nature or even looking up at the sky and asking questions was often considered dangerous. During this time, science was more about preserving the knowledge of the ancients than discovering new truths. But then the time came when brave people emerged, daring to look up at the sky and ask new questions. Nature should be read like a book, and the truth wasn't hidden in sacred texts, but in nature itself. This new way of thinking broke away from the scholastic mindset and paved the way for the scientific method. My child, you must know that the Renaissance was not just a time for the rise of art, music, and literature. It was also an era when the human mind broke free from its chains and became liberated. People were observing, experimenting, and trying to understand the laws of nature. In fields like mathematics, physics, astronomy, medicine, and even chemistry, great strides were being made. Some of the key figures who laid the foundations for this new understanding were scholars like Roger Bacon, who emphasized the experimental method at the end of the Middle Ages. Later, when Nicolaus Copernicus looked up at the sky, he questioned old beliefs and realized that it wasn't the sun that was at the center, but rather the earth that was moving. Galileo Galilei taught that observation and experimentation were essential to understanding nature. Johannes Kepler mathematically defined the movements of the planets. Andreas Vesalius was the first to study human anatomy in detail, revolutionizing medicine. All these efforts heralded the birth of the scientific method. Science was no longer progressing based solely on the authority of the past. Observation, experimentation, and logic came to the forefront. People realized that knowledge could be gained not from sacred books, but from nature itself. But remember, my child, every revolution comes with great struggles. The liberation of knowledge was not welcomed by those in power. The church and defenders of the old order tried every way they could to stop this new knowledge from spreading. Galileo was tried by the Inquisition. Copernicus's theories were dismissed for a long time, and even Vesalius faced harsh criticism in the world of medicine. However, despite all these challenges, the Renaissance scientists never gave up. Thanks to their courage and curiosity, today when we look up at the sky, we understand the secrets of the stars, and we can decipher the workings of nature. They proved that humanity's greatest wealth lies in the mind and curiosity. Now, my child, we are diving deeper into our journey. I will continue to introduce you to the greatest revolutionaries of science. But first, are you ready? Because now we are entering the real story of how science emerged from the darkness. My child, think for a moment. What if we lived in a world where knowledge was only in the hands of a few? How would humanity progress? Let me tell you the story of the printing press, because the real power of science isn't just in knowing, but in sharing what we know. In the mid-15th century, a man named Johannes Gutenberg from Mainz, Germany, made one of the most important inventions in human history, the printing press. Before this, books were made by hand. Copying them took years, and only the rich and the church could afford them. But Gutenberg made it possible to print books using movable metal letters. This wasn't just an invention, it was a revolution. Thanks to the printing press, knowledge was no longer controlled by the church and the nobility. It became accessible to everyone. Scientific books, philosophical writings, works on astronomy and medicine were quickly reproduced. Now, people began to trust their own observations and books to understand how the world worked, rather than relying on the church. This new invention sped up the spread of the Renaissance. Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, Galileo's writings, Kepler's astronomical discoveries. All of these reached large audiences thanks to the printing press. Knowledge was no longer kept hidden. It was reproduced and spread. People were learning, discussing, and forming their own ideas. So, my child, the printing press didn't just print books. It sparked a revolution. It freed the human mind and helped science progress. Now let's continue our journey in the light of knowledge. Ah, my child, come closer and listen. Today I'm going to tell you how one man's courage changed the universe. His name was Nicolaus Copernicus. And if it weren't for his observations, ideas, and bravery, the world you see when you look up at the sky today might be very different. Do you know what people used to think when they looked at the sky? They thought it was a perfectly ordered universe created by God. And at the center of this universe, just like the Holy Scriptures said, was Earth. The sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars, they all moved around us. Ptolemy's theory ruled for centuries. No one dared question it, because it wasn't just a matter of science, it was a matter of belief. But my child, there have always been people throughout history who questioned everything and sought the truth. Copernicus was one of them. Copernicus was born in 1473 in what is now Poland. From a young age, he studied many different fields, including math, law, and medicine. But what really fascinated him was the sky. At the time, astronomy was the science of trying to understand the movements of celestial bodies. But Copernicus noticed that none of the models he learned about made much sense. Ptolemy's model was way too complicated. In this system, where Earth was at the center, the planets appeared to move backward sometimes, and this was explained with nested circles. This system, called epicycles, was like a patched-up quilt. And Copernicus asked himself, if everything is this complicated, maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong. So he set out with that question in mind. For years, he worked quietly, because he knew that if he shared his ideas too early, he could be excommunicated by the church. His greatest weapon was patience. Finally, after years of observations, in 1514, he started writing his first drafts. What he saw was this: Earth wasn't at the center. The sun was at the center, and the planets moved around it. Copernicus turned his findings into a book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. This book would spark one of the greatest revolutions in science. But my child, writing a scientific book at that time, especially one that challenged sacred beliefs, wasn't easy. Copernicus spent many years hesitating to publish it because he was afraid of the church's pressure. However, in 1543, while on his deathbed, the book was finally printed. The story goes that the moment he held the first copy in his hands, he passed away. Not everyone immediately accepted Copernicus's heliocentric model. This wasn't just a scientific claim, it was a big debate about how God ordered the universe. The Catholic Church and many scientists rejected the idea. But my child, big ideas are never accepted right away. The seed falls into the ground, and it takes time to grow. Copernicus' ideas were strengthened by scientists like Galileo Galilei and Johannes Kepler. Galileo turned his telescope to the sky and, by observing the phases of Venus, proved Copernicus was right. Kepler mathematically described the motion of the planets, and in the end, Copernicus' quiet revolution opened the door to a new era in science. Today, the heliocentric model seems so simple and natural, right? But think for a moment. If Copernicus had stopped observing, if those question marks hadn't appeared in his mind, we might still believe that Earth is the center of the universe. So, my child, Copernicus didn't just change the positions of the planets. He changed the way we view ourselves. Now we know we're not the center of the universe. We're living beings on a small planet in the middle of an infinite cosmos. But most importantly, Copernicus taught us this: the pursuit of truth takes courage. Truth sometimes has to wait for years to be accepted, but in the end, the truths always come out like light. Now, my child, let's continue our journey. Because after Copernicus, there was another man who took up that light. Galileo Galilei. Are you ready? Kid. Our journey continues. The seed Copernicus planted was slowly starting to sprout, but the path of science is tough because accepting the truth is never easy. Copernicus's heliocentric model was a great idea, but it wasn't complete. It didn't explain exactly how the planets moved. And that's where another brilliant mind stepped in. Johannes Kepler. This guy's mind seemed like it was coded to understand the sky. His eyes were made to study the movements of the stars and planets. He would take Copernicus's model and refine it, giving it mathematical certainty, eventually revealing the laws of the heavens. But kid, you should know that Kepler's journey wasn't easy. Johannes Kepler was born in 1571 in a small town in Germany. From a young age, he had his eyes fixed on the sky. When he was a kid, his father went off to war and never returned. His mother worked as a healer with herbs and later was even accused of witchcraft. Kepler's childhood was spent in poverty, but that curiosity inside him never faded. Kid, you should know that great scientists are not just great because of their intellect, but because of their perseverance. Despite all the difficulties, Kepler kept studying and showed an incredible talent in mathematics. At that time, anyone who wanted to understand planetary movements was looking at one person, the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe had dedicated his life to observing the sky, collecting the most accurate astronomical data of his time, but his model didn't quite fit Copernicus's theory. When Kepler started working as his assistant, he found a treasure trove of data. But kid, you should know that Brahe wasn't exactly generous with sharing this information. Kepler worked under his supervision for years, but had to wait to learn the real secrets. Then, in 1601, Tycho Brahe suddenly died. Rumor has it he was poisoned. But one thing was for sure, Kepler now had access to all of Brahe's observational data. Kepler threw himself into his work day and night. He studied the movements of the planets, wrestled with numbers, made calculations, and eventually he discovered 3 great laws that filled in the gaps in Copernicus's model. And now, kid, I'm going to tell you the mathematical code of the heavens. Before this, everyone thought the planets moved in perfect circular orbits because, God created the universe perfectly, right? But Kepler had to think beyond religious dogma to find the truth. And then the moment came. After years of calculations, he discovered that the orbits of the planets were actually elliptical. That means the sun wasn't at the exact center of these ellipses, but at one of the focal points. This groundbreaking discovery shattered the old understanding of astronomy. Ellipses. Ah, kid, who would have thought that the universe would be made up of stretched, irregular-looking ellipses instead of perfect circles? But that's how nature works, by its own rules, not by human logic. Kepler's second discovery showed that planets don't move at a constant speed in their orbits. Previously, it was believed that planets traveled at the same speed at all points in their orbits. Kepler realized that a planet speeds up as it gets closer to the sun and slows down as it moves away. But one thing remained constant. The line drawn from the sun to the planet sweeps out equal areas in equal time intervals. This law was further proof that the universe operated in a mechanical order. Now the movements of the planets could be explained by a specific pattern, not randomly. Kepler's third law linked the time it takes for a planet to orbit the sun with the size of its orbit. The square of a planet's orbital period is proportional to the cube of its average distance from the sun. What does this mean, kid? It means this. The inner planets, the ones closer to the sun, move faster, while the outer planets move much slower. This law showed that the movements of the planets could now be predicted with mathematical precision. Kepler's laws didn't just explain the movement of the planets, they also gave us a huge lesson on how the scientific method should work. He tried to understand nature based on experiments, observations, and mathematics. And you should know, kid, that Kepler's laws would lay the foundation for Isaac Newton's great theory of gravity in the years to come. Kepler figured out how the planets moved, and Newton would explain why they moved that way. The great secret of the universe was now within reach of the human mind. And what made that possible was not just incredible intellect, but an unquenchable sense of curiosity. Kid, now when you look at the sky, you should see not just shining dots, but a mathematical order, a rhythm. That's Kepler's legacy. But our journey doesn't end here, because after Kepler, another man would come and discover the greatest force of nature, Isaac Newton and the law of gravity. Are you ready? Let's continue. Ah, my child, come closer, sit by me and listen carefully, because now I'm going to tell you the story of a man who changed the course of science. A man who, by looking at the sky through a telescope, saw things that even God probably didn't want to see. A man who revolutionized the world of science by using math and experiments to decipher nature's language. And that man who was judged and silenced for chasing the truth. But once his ideas came to light, they could never be extinguished. That man's name was Galileo Galilei. If you're ready, I'll take you to the late 16th century, because a great revolution in science was about to begin. My child Galileo was born in 1564 in the small city of Pisa, Italy. Back then, the world was still deeply rooted in Aristotle's teachings. If Aristotle said it, it was true, no question. The planets moved in perfect circles. Heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones, and Earth was the center of the universe. But Galileo's spirit was one of inquiry. He didn't accept knowledge just as it was given to him. Even as a child, he loved making observations. His father was a musician and wanted Galileo to study medicine. But my child, sometimes fate has its own path. Galileo instead became interested in math and physics. Numbers and laws of motion were more appealing to him. Then, during his university years, he realized something big. The world didn't work the way Aristotle said it did. Nature didn't follow someone else's rules. It followed its own. To figure this out, he started doing experiments. And that's where the greatest revolution in the history of science began. Observation and experiment. My child, whether what I'm about to tell you is legend or truth, who knows? But they say Galileo climbed the famous Leaning Tower in Pisa and took two objects of different weights, a According to Aristotle, the heavier object should fall faster, because that's what everyone believed at the time. But Galileo wanted to test this idea. He dropped both objects at the same time. And do you know what he saw? They both hit the ground at the same time. This was a major blow to Aristotle's understanding of physics. What determined how fast an object fell wasn't its weight, it was gravity. But my child, you must know that defenders of the old order wouldn't accept such a truth easily. Galileo was starting to make enemies, but he hadn't even made his biggest discoveries yet. In 1609, Galileo heard something very interesting. He learned that some lens makers in the Netherlands had invented a device that could make objects appear larger. Today we call this a telescope. Galileo took this information, improved it, and built his own telescope. But he didn't just use it to spot distant ships like merchants did. No, my child, he turned that telescope toward the sky. And what he saw would change the course of history. First, he looked at the moon. He had thought the moon's surface was a smooth sphere, because that's what Aristotle had said. But when he looked through his telescope, do you know what he saw? Craters, valleys, mountains. The moon wasn't a perfect sphere, as the ancient sages had said. It looked more like Earth. Then he looked at Jupiter, and he saw 4 tiny dots orbiting the planet. These were Jupiter's moons. But do you know what that meant? If these moons were orbiting Jupiter, then not everything was orbiting Earth. And one of his biggest discoveries, Venus viz phases. Venus, like the moon, went through phases. This could only mean one thing. Venus was orbiting the sun. My child, these discoveries prove the accuracy of Copernicus's heliocentric model. But these discoveries also put Galileo in great danger. The authority of the church couldn't be questioned. The belief that Earth was the center of the universe had become a religious doctrine. But Galileo's observations were shaking this belief. In 1616, the Catholic Church declared Copernicus' theory heretical. Galileo was asked not to support it. Years passed, but Galileo didn't remain silent. In 1632, he published his book, Dialogue on the Two Great World Systems, where he argued that Earth orbited the sun. This time, the church didn't forgive him. He was brought before the Inquisition. The judges accused him of blasphemy and heresy. If he didn't recount his ideas, he would be thrown in jail or maybe even killed. And then that moment came, my child. A paper was placed in front of Galileo. He had to either deny the heliocentric model or spend the rest of his life in a cell. Galileo, in order to survive, was forced to sign it. He denied that the sun was the center. But they say that as he left the courtroom, he looked down and whispered, "Epersi movo," and yet it moves. Oh, my child, Galileo's story didn't end there. He spent his final years under house arrest, but his ideas were free. The path he opened led Isaac Newton to discover the laws of gravity. His legacy showed that observation and experimentation are sacred in science. Galileo's name was tried to be erased, but they failed. Today we call him the father of modern science. And now, my child, when you look at the night sky, you should see not just the stars, but the truth that Galileo left behind for us. Now, kid, come closer, sit next to me, because today I'm going to tell you the story of one of the greatest revolutionaries in medicine, someone who illuminated the mysteries of the human body. He was the one who broke the chains of dogma and saw human anatomy with his own eyes, revealing the truth. He was the one who questioned the ancient scholars and showed that science isn't just learned from books, but directly from nature itself. His name was Andreas Vesalius, and his story is one of the biggest medical revolutions of the Renaissance. If you're ready, I'm taking you to 16th century Europe, that fascinating time when science and art were being reborn. Because here, not just the sky, but the human body would be discovered too. Kid, the human body has always been a mystery throughout history. But the keys to this mystery were kept locked away. In the Middle Ages, knowledge of anatomy and medicine was almost entirely based on the teachings of ancient Greek and Roman scholars, especially the teachings of a Roman doctor named Galen, who ruled the medical world. Galen was a great sage who lived in the 2nd century, but his knowledge of anatomy was based on his studies of animals, not humans. Yes, you heard me right, kid. Galen studied monkeys and pigs, not the human body, but no one dared question his knowledge. The church considered these ancient teachings sacred. Anatomy lessons weren't about studying cadavers, they were all about reading books. Professors would read Galen's writings aloud, and the students would memorize them word for word. And here's the interesting part. Even though cadavers were rarely studied, students believed what was written in books, not what they saw with their own eyes. And it was in such an environment that Andreas Vesalius stepped in, and kid, when he arrived, the medical world would never be the same again. Vesalius was born in 1514 in Brussels, Belgium. His family was full of doctors, so medicine was in his blood. At a young age, he went to the University of Paris, where he studied anatomy. But even in the classrooms where he studied, Galen's books were taught as absolute truth. Cadavers weren't examined, only old writings were read. But Vesalius was different, kid. He wanted to see for himself. He had the spirit of someone who wasn't afraid to question the old scholars. And then he made a bold decision. He started working on cadavers with his own hands. At that time, finding a human cadaver was a huge problem. The church considered working on human bodies a sin, but Vesalius secretly found cadavers in graveyards and from executed criminals. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He picked up the knife and began to reveal the secrets of the human body, one by one. And you know what he found, kid? The information written in Galen's books was full of mistakes. For example, Galen said that the human lower jaw was made of 2 bones, but when Vesalius looked at a cadaver's jaw, what did he see? It was made of just 1 bone. Galen said that humans had 7 pairs of true ribs, but when Vesalius counted, what did he see? There were 8 pairs, and one of the biggest mistakes. Galen claimed that there was a small hole in the human heart through which blood passed from one side to the other. But when Vesalius opened the heart with his own hands, he saw that the hole didn't exist at all. That's when, kid, Vesalius realized that real knowledge doesn't come just from books, but from directly observing nature itself. De humani corporis fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. And so, in 1543, when he was just 29 years old, he wrote one of the greatest works in medicine. De humani corporis fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. This work was a masterpiece of anatomy. For the first time, the human body was presented with scientifically accurate and detailed illustration. And kid, these illustrations were so detailed and artistic that even today they're admired in the medical world. Because Vesalius' book was a revolution that combined art and science. The book corrected hundreds of mistakes made by Galen and presented the human body in its true form. Bones, muscles, nerves, organs, everything was shown clearly like never before. And this book laid the foundation for modern science, which is based on experiments and observation. But kid, don't forget, telling the truth is never without its price. Traditionalists saw Vesalius' work as blasphemy. They called him the man who betrayed Galen. Big debates erupted in the medical world. Some doctors rejected what was written in the book because it was hard to accept that the knowledge that had been taught for thousands of years was wrong. Vesalius' biggest enemy throughout his life was the people who were afraid to question old knowledge. But kid, science couldn't be stopped. His ideas were accepted over time, and today Vesalius is considered the father of modern anatomy. Even today, in medical schools, anatomy lessons still involve studying cadavers. This tradition began because of Vesalius' courage. If a doctor, a surgeon, or an anatomy expert knows the human body, it's because of the sacrifices Vesalius made for science in dark graveyards. despite the church's prohibitions. And kid, this teaches us a lesson. Oh, to see the truth, you have to look with your own eyes. Books are important, but the greatest knowledge is hidden in nature itself. And that's the story of the man who uncovered the secrets of the human body. And now, if you ever become a doctor, remember Vesalius's legacy, because science rises on the shoulders of brave people. Come here, sit next to me, get comfortable, because today I'm going to tell you about a man who shook the very foundations of science and completely changed the way we understand the world. He looked at the sky, saw an apple fall, and showed us how not just objects, but thoughts themselves should fall to the ground. He changed the way humanity understands nature forever. Yep, today I'm going to tell you the story of Isaac Newton. Now think about this, kid. Back in the day, when people looked up at the sky, they couldn't understand why planets and stars moved the way they did. They couldn't explain why the earth spun or why things fell to the ground. It was like everything was controlled by some supernatural force. But then, along came a man who cracked the code of the universe. Today, I'm going to tell you how the foundations of one of the greatest works in the history of science, Principia Mathematica, were laid, and how Newton changed the world. But first, you need to know what kind of world he was born into. Isaac Newton was born in 1642 in a small village called Woolsthorpe in England. But his birth wasn't exactly ordinary. When Newton was born, England was on the brink of civil war. The country was in chaos, conflicts, power struggles, religious wars. It wasn't exactly the kind of time you'd expect a child to grow up to be one of the greatest minds in history, right? But kid, sometimes the brightest stars shine the most in the darkest nights. Newton's father passed away 3 months before he was born. Little Isaac grew up as an orphan. He was weak, fragile, and introverted. People expected him to become a farmer, but his mind wasn't in the fields, it was in the sky. He had something inside him, an insatiable curiosity. And so destiny led him to Cambridge University. But kid, Newton's greatest journey in science started because of a plague. It was 1665. A terrible plague broke out in London. Universities closed and students went back home. Newton had to return to his village in Woolsthorpe. But kid, those 2 years of isolation turned out to be one of the most productive periods in the history of science. During this time, Newton made 3 major discoveries. 1, he laid the foundations for calculus. Yeah, kid. The origins of differential and integral calculus trace back to this. 2, he worked on light and optics. He discovered that white light is actually made up of multiple colors, O3. And most importantly, he developed the law of gravity. And here comes the famous story I have to tell you. One day, Newton was sitting in his garden, and then something happened. An apple fell from a tree. Kid, a lot of people would have just watched the apple fall, but no one would have thought to ask why. But Newton did. Why does this apple always fall down and not go up? And more importantly, he thought, could the same force that makes this apple fall also keep the moon in orbit around the Earth? That simple yet revolutionary question was the first step in Newton developing his universal law of gravitation. Until then, people thought the movement of objects in the sky and the movement of objects on Earth were completely separate things. But Newton discovered that there's one force that governs the entire universe: gravity. This was one of the greatest discoveries in human history. Oh kid, years passed. Newton delved deeper into his studies, and in 1687, he wrote one of the most important scientific works in history, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. This book became one of the cornerstones of science, and inside there were 3 major laws. The law of inertia: an object will continue in its state of motion or rest unless acted upon by a force. It was the first time we truly understood the nature of motion. O, F equals ma, the law of force, mass, and acceleration. Acceleration, this is the foundation of modern physics. The law of action and reaction. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Even today, it's used in fields from engineering to space science. And of course, the most important thing, the universal law of gravitation. Newton's book changed science forever. Before, people trying to understand nature could only guess, but now they could explain the universe using mathematical formulas. And here's what Newton's greatest achievement was. He took science from being just a philosophical idea and turned it into a system that could be proven with experiments and math. After Newton, science was no longer seen as a world of unknowns, but as a universe governed by certain rules. His discoveries not only helped us understand how planets move, but also how waves in the ocean work, the path of cannonballs, engineering calculations, and even the rockets we send into space today. And kid, there's something you should never forget. Newton described himself as a dwarf standing on the shoulders of giants. To him, his achievements were based on the work of great scientists before him: Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo. Newton built upon the paths they paved. And the journey of science didn't stop there. Einstein took the foundations Newton laid and pushed them even further, and today scientists are still inspired by his work. What does Newton's story teach us, kid? Knowledge belongs to those who question. If you really want to understand something, you shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. When you sit under an apple tree, don't just rest in its shade. Ask why that apple falls. Because maybe you're the next Newton on the verge of solving the mysteries of the universe. Ah, kid, come closer, sit next to me. Because today, I'm going to tell you about one of the most rebellious, rule-breaking, and extraordinary men in the history of science. His name was Paracelsus. And kid, this man wasn't just a scientist. He was a doctor, an alchemist, a traveler. But most of all, he was a revolutionary who challenged the dogmas. Take a deep breath, because today we're going on a journey that stretches from the mystical world of the Middle Ages to the birth of modern chemistry. Kid, there was a time when people turned to magic and mysticism to understand matter and nature. Alchemists were trying to turn metals into gold and searching for the philosopher's stone that could grant immortality. Alchemy was intertwined with mystical teachings. Doing experiments was important, but those experiments were mixed with mystical rituals trying to unlock divine secrets. And in this dark, mysterious world, a man named Paracelsus was born. Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Yeah, kid, that was his real name. But he thought it was way too long, so he preferred to go by Paracelsus. He was born in 1493 in Switzerland, and even as a child he had an insatiable thirst for knowledge. His father was a doctor, and little Theophrastus was taught the basics of medicine and chemistry, but his curiosity wasn't limited to books. Kid, Paracelsus was not your average scientist. He rejected the idea of learning knowledge solely from old books. To him, true knowledge had to be gained through direct observation and experimentation. That's why he traveled all around Europe studying healers, alchemists, and doctors from different countries. For him, a street healer was just as important as a university professor. He believed that the herbal remedies and folk knowledge used by regular people were just as valuable as academic teachings. And it was these unconventional ideas that would eventually lead him to revolutionize the world of medicine. Kid, medicine in the Middle Ages was a field filled with outdated practices and dogma. Students would memorize the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen to become doctors, but no one ever questioned that knowledge. Paracelsus, however, rebelled against these ancient traditions. One day he was called to give a lecture at the University of Basel, and there, in front of all the students and professors, he threw the books of Galen and Hippocrates into the fire. Yeah, kid, that day marked the beginning of a revolt in the world of medicine. Paracelsus said, "True knowledge is not learned from old books, but directly from nature." To him, diseases weren't caused by imbalances in the four bodily humors, like the ancient writers said. No, the cause of diseases was external substances and toxins in the world around us. And this thinking would lay the foundation for modern medicine and pharmacology. Kid, doctors in the Middle Ages would try to treat their patients by bleeding them, sticking leeches on them, or using mystical rituals. But Paracelsus suggested that chemical substances could be used for treatment. He was one of the first doctors to study the medicinal effects of minerals and chemicals. And so the foundations of modern pharmacology were laid. For the first time, chemical substances like mercury, sulfur, and lead were used to treat diseases. For example, diseases like syphilis were deadly at the time, but Paracelsus showed that mercury-based medicines could treat syphilis. This was the entry of chemistry into the world of medicine. Now, diseases were being addressed not with mystical explanations, but with chemical processes. And so alchemy slowly started turning into chemistry. Paracelsus explained nature through three fundamental elements: sulfur, combustibility and soul; mercury, fluidity and mind. These were a rebellion against the ancient alchemists' teachings of the four elements. But more importantly, Paracelsus believed that diseases were caused by imbalances between these elements. This was the first step toward modern biochemistry. And that's why Paracelsus is known as the father of chemistry. But Kit, like all revolutionaries, Paracelsus paid a heavy price. His ideas were rejected by the academic circles of the time. To the church and the medical authorities, he was a heretic, a madman, a troublemaker. He was exiled from many cities, ridiculed, and sometimes even threatened with death. But he didn't give up. His students continued spreading his teachings. And after his death, Paracelsus' ideas became one of the cornerstones of modern medicine.
Kid, every medicine you get from pharmacies today has passed through the path Paracelsus paved. His ideas about chemical medicines led to the birth of modern pharmacology. His emphasis on nature and experimentation led the way for the advancement of science. And perhaps most importantly, he taught us this: true knowledge is not hidden in old books, but in nature itself. If one day you set off on your own journey, don't forget, kid, the greatest way to reach knowledge is through questioning. And thanks to brave scientists like Paracelsus, today chemistry and medicine have become sciences free from magic and superstitions. This is the story of how alchemy turned into chemistry and mysticism into science. And remember, kid, science always rises in the hands of those who question. Kid, come sit down, settle in. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of how one of the greatest mysteries of the human body was solved. There was a time when doctors didn't really understand how blood moved through the body. They thought that blood was made in the liver, and once it spread through the body, it just disappeared. But the truth was something completely different. Today, you're going to hear the story of the man who corrected this huge misconception, William Harvey, and the discovery of blood circulation. The time Harvey lived in was one where the scientific world was just starting to grow, and old beliefs were starting to fall apart. Back then, Galileo was looking up at the sky, Kepler was studying the movement of the planets, and Vesalius was uncovering the secrets of the human body. But one of the greatest mysteries about the human body was how the heart and blood worked. And it was up to William Harvey to solve this mystery. William Harvey was born on April 1, 1578, in a town called Folkestone, England. He entered Cambridge University at a young age. But it was when he went to Padua University to study medicine that the real doors to his future opened. Kid, Padua University was one of Europe's top medical schools back then. Here, he was taught by the world-renowned anatomist Hieronymus Fabricius. Fabricius had made many discoveries about the human body, especially noticing the small valves inside veins. But he didn't know what these valves were for. And this is where the first sparks of Harvey's genius started. He began to ask that big question about how blood moves through the body. Was blood really made in the liver and just used up? Or was it circulating through the body in some kind of order? At Harvey's time, the accepted idea about blood circulation came from the ancient Greek physician Galen. Galen believed there were two types of blood: dark venous blood coming from the liver that carried nutrients to the body, light arterial blood from the left side of the heart that carried life force from the lungs, and most importantly, he thought blood was constantly being produced, flowing out to organs and then disappearing. But Harvey realized there was a problem with this idea. If Galen was right, the body would have to produce new blood every day. But based on his calculations, it would be impossible for such a large amount of blood to be continuously produced. That's when the idea popped into his head that blood was circulating in a constant loop. Kid, Harvey wasn't someone who just learned from books. He was a scientist who searched for the truth through experiments. He studied the flow of blood by experimenting on animals. He especially watched the movements of the heart for a long time, and eventually discovered one of the greatest secrets of the human body. The heart works like a pump, just like Galen had claimed. Blood didn't disappear. Instead, it was pumped by the heart and flowed through the veins in a continuous loop. In his experiments, Harvey noticed that the small valves in veins made sure blood only flowed in one direction. If Galen were right, blood should flow backwards too, but it didn't. This was a huge revolution. Blood was pumped out from the heart, flowed through the whole body, and returned to the heart. In 1628, Harvey published his findings in a book called De Motu Cordis, on the motion of the heart. In this book, he explained the true nature of blood circulation. He showed how the heart contracts and relaxes to pump blood through the body, how blood is in constant motion, and how this process is directed by the valves in the veins. But kid, great discoveries are always met with great opposition. The medical world wasn't ready to question Galen's teachings that had been around for centuries. Many doctors rejected Harvey's ideas. Some even thought he had lost his mind. But Harvey knew that the truth, proven by experiments, would eventually be accepted. And over time, more scientists confirmed Harvey's findings. The theory of blood circulation slowly started to be accepted in the medical world. Kid, one of the biggest foundations of modern medicine today, is built on Harvey's discoveries. Understanding how the heart and vascular system work has led to advances in medical treatments. Thanks to him, blood circulation stopped being a mystical concept and became a scientific fact. And today, scientists following in Harvey's footsteps are still working to treat heart diseases, improve surgical techniques, and uncover the greatest secrets of the human body. So, kid, feel your next heartbeat. Think about that rhythmic motion, that strong pump. You'll realize that the great secret Harvey uncovered is at work every moment. Your heart is beating and your blood is flowing nonstop, just like Harvey discovered centuries ago. Oh, kid, today I'm going to introduce you to one of the greatest geniuses in human history. This man wasn't just a painter, sculptor, engineer, or anatomist. He was a wise man who blended all these fields perfectly and made knowledge his art. Meet Leonardo da Vinci. Today, we usually remember him for the mysterious smile of the Mona Lisa or the perfect composition of the Last Supper. But kid, Leonardo wasn't just an artist. He was a scientist who observed nature, who tried to understand how everything worked, and whose hunger for learning never ended. And now I'm going to take you into his world. A man who shaped art with brushstrokes, designed machines with his pen, and uncovered the secrets of the human body with his scalpel. Leonardo was born in 1452 in a town in Italy called Vinci. Yep, he got his name from the town he was born in. He received his education in Florence, and it didn't take long for people to realize how extraordinary his talent was. But what truly set him apart wasn't just his skill in art, it was his deep curiosity about everything. When he looked at the sky, he didn't just see clouds, he wondered how they moved. When he watched a bird flap its wings, he didn't just admire its beauty, he tried to solve the mystery of flight. When he looked at the human body, he wasn't just interested in its aesthetics, he wanted to understand how the muscles worked, how the veins carried blood. That's why Leonardo couldn't stick to just one field. His mind was like a wind, trying to discover every aspect of knowledge. Kid, even in the 15th century, Leonardo was trying to figure out how the human body worked. Today, many of the anatomical drawings used by scientists and doctors were shaped by Leonardo's sharp observations and incredible attention to detail. Back then, there was a lot of misinformation about how the human body functioned, but Leonardo wanted to see for himself. That's why he started studying cadavers. His drawings were so precise and detailed that even today, medical students still learn from his sketches. He depicted how heart valves worked, how muscle fibers stretched, and how embryos developed in the womb. However, the church authorities didn't approve of these studies. Anatomical dissections were a highly controversial subject back then. That's why some of Leonardo's works remained hidden for centuries. Leonardo wasn't just trying to understand the human body, he was also trying to figure out how machines and nature worked. He created engineering drawings far ahead of his time. Many of the machines we use today were designed by him in the 15th century. The first helicopter design was his. He drew machines that worked automatically. He designed war machines. He developed hydraulic systems. But the technology of his time wasn't advanced enough to bring his designs to life. Leonardo's ideas wouldn't become reality until centuries later. Botany and understanding nature, another passion of Leonardo's, was plants. He had an incredible admiration for nature. He studied how plants grew and why their leaves were arranged in a particular pattern. Today, botanists recognize that his observations were astonishingly accurate. That's because Leonardo had noticed the mathematical proportions that explained the growth patterns of plants. And this is what made Leonardo so unique. He was a genius who combined art and science. Even today, the paintings and sketches he made are not only artistic works, but also proof of scientific discoveries. The way he used light and shadow in his art, his understanding of depth, and his ability to portray the human body with incredible accuracy were all the direct results of his scientific knowledge. Well, and don't forget, kid, today we're trying to break down the boundaries between science, art, and engineering. But Leonardo did that 500 years ago. Leonardo da Vinci wasn't just a painter, an inventor, or an anatomist. He was a man who touched every field, who tried to learn everything. His legacy doesn't just lie in the Mona Lisa's smile or in engineering drawings. It also lies in the endless pursuit of knowledge by the human mind. Today, every scientist, artist, and inventor follows in his footsteps. And maybe the greatest lesson Leonardo left us with is this: there are no limits to knowledge. Be curious, learn, and keep discovering. And that's how it is, kid. Today, I took you into a unique world where science, art, and engineering intersect. You've met one of the greatest minds in history, and I hope a piece of his spirit comes alive in you too. Now close your eyes and think, what can you do to learn what you don't know? Are you ready to discover something new? Because, kid, if you want to follow Leonardo's path, you must never stop seeking knowledge. And remember, it all starts with asking a question.